Well, hi everyone. Here we are again, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, myself, Ken Ham, CEO of Answers in Genesis Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. And we are up to number 19. So I don't know about you, Nathaniel, but I think I feel a little bit like the little boy once who was at a conference and he came up afterwards and he said, Mr. Ham, I've been listening to all the talks and my brain is full. So I don't know how many people out there are like him and their brain is full, but we are on to episode 19. If people want to see all the episodes, they're all there on answers.tv. That's our streaming service, very inexpensive. For a year subscription, just over $3 a month, and you get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Answers in Genesis videos. We've got Spanish ones up there now. We're also putting Arabic up, as well as all of the English ones, of course. And you can also go to our YouTube channel, the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel. But today, episode 19, what happened to the ancient Egyptians? You know, few cultures evoke as much passion, curiosity, and mystery as ancient Egypt. Of course, the giant pyramids, powerful pharaohs, glittering tombs, mummies from the dawn of civilization. Well, the dawn, you know, in a sense, after the flood. Egypt is hard to ignore. What happened to these people? Who are their descendants? The Egyptians of today? Who are they? Or might the genealogy of these peoples reach much further than the Nile Valley, the river valley, and into Europe? What relationship does Egypt have to sub-Saharan Africa? How did these regions of Africa interact before the arrival of European explorers? Okay, my brain is full just thinking about all of that. So you're going to join us today as we unravel, well, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson is, with all of his studies, unravel the enigma of ancient Africa. And as you do that, I want people to keep in mind that a lot of this research is based on genetics. I mean, this is the new history of the human race. Well, when we say new history, compared to what the secular world teaches, of course it is rewriting history, but not rewriting biblical history, rewriting secular history, so to speak. And your research on the Y chromosome, where that is inherited through the male, and you can look at the differences and similarities as you compare people groups all around the world, and it helps you understand relationships, and so how closely related they are and how people were connected. And so, okay, here we are. We're ready for what happened to the ancient Egyptians. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson.
I was reminded of the stereotypes we carry into questions like these when my wife and I were watching a National Geographic episode recently on ancient Egypt and the gold treasures of King Tut's tomb and these sorts of topics that never grow old. And I noticed how the Egyptian archaeologists, as part of the show, would own ancient Egypt as their own. And that sort of common assumption, the country I live in, means the ancestors the people who came before me must be my ancestors. That seems all too common. It's an assumption I've taken for granted myself, and we're seeing time and time again this turns out not to be true. There's been much more migration, interaction, intermixing among peoples than we previously thought, and we get to tackle that question head on today as part of the larger question of what's the relationship among peoples on the globe. We've been spending a lot of time looking at peoples alive today and their relationships among them in the past. This now brings us closer to the question of what is the relationship between these ancient cultures, many of them famous and ones we hold with reverence and awe, and peoples alive today. Could there be Caucasians like me of European descent who have a relationship genealogically to the ancient Egyptians? Today's episode is also when we get to finally deliver on the promise that so-called black white people exist, Caucasians who've had dark-skinned ancestry in their past. We've seen in previous episodes fulfillment of the promise I made that to see that most Europeans are of recent Asian ancestry, that these nationalities that we take such pride in, German, French, Greek, Roman, disappear within a few hundred years in the human family tree. We've looked at the pre-Columbian Americas and seen a shocking find there. And next week, we're going to look at finally this question of some of the most ancient history, the Neanderthals and who they were and their relationship to ancient catastrophes. And my hope in all this is that we'd marvel at who we came from and the stories of those we love in a way we probably never dreamed of marveling before. I've discovered that this is one of many possible reactions to what we've seen. Another is to take offense, because we're touching on dearly held nationalities. So you think about, what is the origin of Jewish people today? And some of what we discussed in the past episode, I found people aren't necessarily too happy with, because we're rewriting some of how people think about their own story. But this is what genetics records, and sometimes it's unpleasant. And my hope is that we'd all be able to sit back and say, this is an incredible story that God has ordained. And in our next episode, we'll look at some of the more biblical background to what we've been discussing so far. If you've grown up like me, Africa forms the foundation of the mainstream account of human origins. Now, I grew up in a Christian household, creationist household, yet you can't help but notice from the mainstream sources all around us, National Geographic and just what's on TV, that the mainstream narrative puts Africa at the beginning of human history, modern human history. They say hundreds of thousands of years ago, the first anatomically modern humans arose from an ape-like existence on the plain savannas of Africa. And this map summarizes, in a nutshell, one screen, the long time scale of human history according to evolution, beginning here in ancient Africa 200,000 years ago, sometimes now 300,000 years ago, migrating out of Africa 100,000, 50,000 years ago, and spreading out through the rest of the globe. And as we saw in previous episodes, 15,000 years ago, relatively recently, according to evolution, moved into the Americas. Now, 200,000 years ago is a big landmark. In my mind, there's still a lot of blanks to be filled in mainstream science between the origin of mankind and the first civilizations. But once again, even in mainstream science, Africa sits at the dawn of human civilization with ancient Egypt. And to this day, for good reason, we still marvel at the wonders and treasures of ancient Egypt. It's one of the cradles of civilization that archaeological textbooks will speak of, that along with Mesopotamia and Indus River Valley and China and central Mexico. But for me, even growing up taking Western civilization, while Africa may be at the dawn of history after the flood and plays a prominent role in the history of Israel biblically, in my mind, there still was a big blank between ancient Egypt and some of the interactions between that civilization and ancient Israel. There's still a big blank between the people migrating after Babel and everything that's going on south of Egypt, sub-Saharan Africa. It's been a big mystery for me for a long time, especially its relationship to ancient Egypt. And my history that I grew up with it's basically Egypt, then nothingness or uncertainty, until we get to the age of exploration and the arrival of missionaries, explorers, Europeans in the sub-Saharan African region in the last few hundred years. So what is the story of Africa, especially as it relates to ancient Egypt? There's this big several thousand year gap between the cradles of civilization and the history as I was taught in sub-Saharan Africa, especially, beginning with Livingstone and such. And of course, there's the question of what do you do with all the history mainstream folks talk about in Africa prior to this? How does Egypt fit into all this? What does genetics say about it? Because we're at episode 19, I'm going to review the previous episodes very quickly, just in case there are folks joining us for the first time. Episode 1, we looked at the history of human population growth, the history of peoples, and seeing how very different it is from the history of politics. And this sets the foundation for everything we've said going forward. Episode 2 looked at the math of our family trees to see how much more connected we are than we think in shocking ways. Episodes 3 and 4 looked at the genetics of ethnic change and the math of human reproductive rates, and seeing that you can have one ethnic group take over another silently in ways we never would expect. You can have most Europeans be of African ancestry and not know it, in theory. Episodes 5 and 6 laid the foundation for all that we've said since, looking at genetic clocks that exist in each of us, changes that happen at the DNA level that mark off the passage of time and allow us to reconstruct a family tree for the globe. And we've seen that it's the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome, that's the key to all this. And this is not anything you'd find with mainstream popular genetic testing like 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, one of these sites, Ancestry.com. This is something unique to Answers in Genesis, to the creationist community. This is information you can find only here. So we began to explore this tree in episode 7, looking for lost relatives of Europe, and we found some in India, in Central Asia. In episode 8, we saw the explanation seems to be the Mongol Empire and its aftermath, the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Episode 9, we saw a connection to ancient China, and one that connects to modern Europe through the barbarians of the north, it appears. We turned our attention to Western Europe and the Americas, since they're related, in episode 10, and saw that there's a hidden history here. The ancestors of most Western Europeans are Central Asians, in a way we wouldn't expect, and that goes back just about 1,000 years. We then turned the page to the pre-Columbian Americas in episode 11, looking at dramatic changes in mainstream archaeology. We applied the human family tree to this question and saw a gigantic shock in episode 12. There's been a resettling. Today's Native Americans were not the first Americans. This caused us in episode 13 to revisit some of the oral histories of Native Americans and saw that they may have actually recorded this first in a way that most folks have not paid attention to. 14, we looked at some of the famous civilizations of the Americas, like the Mayans, and why they collapsed, and saw that this new discovery about an invasion of the Americas before Columbus may explain this. 15, we saw a relationship between ancient Native Americans and Europeans that I never would have predicted. 16, we turned our attention to who were the first Americans and potential relationships to the ancient cultures of the Pacific and Aboriginal Australia. 17, we looked at what happened to the Vikings returning to Europe and some of the earliest European civilizations, and the role that the Black Death may have played in the proliferation of these Central Asian lineages in the modern era. 18, we looked at the question of the Jews and some very popular claims of so-called Jewish lineages and the evidence for and against it, and the question of whether or not we can identify Moses, Abraham's DNA. And this is a question we'll pick up again next week. Today we want to look at the question of what happened to the ancient Egyptians. This brings us closer to the beginnings of post-flood history and to the history of ancient Israel. There's been 2 major studies we've been looking at. I want to return to them again. Both of them sample a number of African lineages, not necessarily Egyptian ones, but these will still provide us clues by which we can get back to this ancient history. You'll notice here that this 1,000 Genomes project, that's the name of it, looked not at the majority of the geographic sections of the globe, but at the major places of where the people are, which is India, China, Western Africa, Europe, so forth. And you can see there's a number of African lineages right here where there's a high concentration of peoples. Well, these African lineages show up down here. You may have noticed in previous episodes, there's this very long branch that comes out that we have not discussed up until this point. And you may have been wondering how this affects everything we've been discussing, because it looks like it doesn't fit all these other lineages that we've looked at in previous episodes. How can you have people with such long branches going into the future? What does this mean? And this plays a huge role in the apologetic discussion and the question of where did humanity first arise, in Africa or elsewhere. The second study shows something similar. Again, they also sampled much of, or a good chunk of Africa, at least of where the people are. They didn't sample as deeply as the 1,000 Genomes project. They looked at a wider geographic swath of the globe, but looked at fewer people within each population. Once again, though, you can see the Africans down here, and especially the long branches in these African lineages. So what is this? A critic might say, this is the evidence against everything I've said. This odd outlier, long branches that imply a history that's in the future, that just doesn't fit. And the way they'd say, we need to reorient the tree is to place the beginning somehow here. Make all the branches equal in length, like this mainstream scientific paper did. We're not going to zoom in here, but the African lineages are in red down here. I said we should orient the tree by putting start right here. They would say, no. These long branches, you have to orient the whole tree so that everyone lands and comes to the present at the same point in time. So that means if you do the mental gymnastics to reorient the tree, that puts these long branches way back here. It extends the history of humanity way into the distant past, and then also means the first lineages that branch off are Africans. So the orientation of the family tree, that's the point here, is the basis, part of the basis for the mainstream community saying we arose in Africa first. However, there's a key assumption in all of this. The assumption in all of this is that the rate at which the Y chromosome clock ticks, and we said the basis for this ticking is the imperfect inheritance of this Y chromosome from fathers to sons, these copying mistakes. They assume that the rate at which the clock ticks is the same in all lineages. Now, why would I call that an assumption? Why wouldn't I just say this is a measurement? Well, because the only father-son Y chromosome clock rates that have been measured in Europeans, not in Africans. No one has actually gotten African fathers and sons, especially the DNA from African fathers and sons in those long lineages, to see how fast or slow the clock ticks. What if their clock ticks twice as fast, three times as fast? Let's say instead of 2 to 3 mistakes per generation, it's 4 to 6. That's not a big difference, but it'll lead, if that's true, to these long branches over time. There's an indirect way to test this, and it relates to something we discussed back in episode 6, the smoking gun of human history, the history of human population growth. You can go back to that episode to see the details, but the point is, the branches on a family tree reflect changes in population size. In a sense, this is self-evident. In terms of my Y chromosome inheritance, I have 3 boys, so there's 1 branch for me, and then it goes into 3, my 3 boys, and in my little nuclear family, the number of branches on my family tree is reflected of the population size of men in my family. That principle is applicable around the globe. So you can count the number of branches in the global human family tree at any particular point in time to get a sense for how many people there are. We talked about how the shape of human population growth over history, and I've drawn it here beginning in 1000 BC up to close to the present, has sort of this hockey stick shape where it's gradual growth for 2,000 years and then it shoots up in the last few hundred. Well, if you reconstruct the history of human population growth, count the number of branches within the global human family tree, but from a perspective of the tree being only 4,500 years old, you get a very close match between what we know from archaeology and history, written history, like Roman census records, Chinese census records. Compare that to what we get from the Y chromosome, boom, there it is. That's the smoking gun. Now, what we may not have discussed in as much detail, which you may not have realized, is all that comes and is based on where you put the start. So let me show you what I mean. What if we reorient the tree and we say, okay, let's see what happens if we do what the evolutionists say we should do. We should reorient the tree, put the African branches in the back, and totally turn it all around so that all the branches are the same length. We assume that the clock ticks the same rate, and this means we must have started in Africa. All that, everything that goes with the evolutionary model, except the total time scale. We say it's still 4,500 years, but it begins way back here in Africa. That's where Noah is. Well, you can then try to reconstruct the history of human population growth, and what you find is it's a much poorer match. So you notice right here, again, the hockey stick shape in this light blue right here from archaeology and from history. If you then say, well, what happens if we say the tree starts in Africa and we reorient the whole thing like the evolutionists say? Well, it's below the line. It doesn't match for here. It doesn't match for from 1000 BC, first 1,000 years. It's about 2,000 years of being off the blue line, and then it finally jumps up and starts matching. So let's compare these side by side. If we put Noah where I say we should be putting Noah, we get a 95% match between the tan line and the blue lines. If you put Noah back here where the evolutionists say we should, you get about a 27% match between the tan line and the blue line. So here's empirical scientific evidence that this is orienting the tree wrong. This is straight from science, and you can read more about this if you're interested in the technical details in these papers that I published. So that's just one glimpse into the scientific reasons why it's entirely appropriate to remove this part of the mainstream story off the human timeline. We didn't come from some primitive ape-like creature in Africa. We came from Noah and his family a few thousand years ago, somewhere in the Middle East, and then boom, they dispersed. So let's focus now and turn our attention to the human timeline, the human history, and especially African history, so that we can get at the question of ancient Egypt. So we're going to go back to this tree with Noah back here. And so just to wrap up what I just said, the strong implication of what I just showed you is that these particular Africans perhaps have their clock ticking a little bit faster. Now, someone has asked me, doesn't that add some uncertainty or error to what I'm doing? In theory, yes. In practice, no. That's been accounted for. I just haven't said so. It's in the papers that I published. That's been accounted for from the start and has very little effect on what we're doing. I accounted for that fact, and it changes very little of what we've discussed. So let's turn our attention to these African lineages. We've talked about in previous episodes that the major divisions in the global Y chromosome family tree are assigned labels in a systematic manner. These are some of the major African branches. It ain't pretty. Science isn't well known for coming up with aesthetically pleasing and nice looking names. It's pretty ugly, but it's functional. There's a system to doing all this that isn't pretty, but it helps you know where you are in the tree. We talked about how if you go back to the beginning, the several initial early major divisions in the family tree are assigned an arbitrary letter of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, R, S, so forth. If some of those deep branches themselves branch again later in history, they're assigned a number, E1, E2. If those subsequent branches then divide again, you get another letter, E1A, E1B. And every time you keep branching, as you go on through history, another letter, another number, E1B, E1A. That's how you get these very ugly labels like right here. What this means is it's the deep branch E, first division, divided again, divided again, divided again. Ugly, but that's the way it works, helps you know what's going on. So there's 6 major branches in these studies that we've been discussing. I'm going to remove 2 of them. The first one, I'm going to remove E2 because it's only about 4% of the African lineages that we see today. I'm also going to remove E1 just to keep the discussion simple because it's only it averages about 5% in sub-Saharan Africa. The ones that are of most interest for our discussion today are these 4 lineages right here, A, B, and then 2 subdivisions within E1, E1B1A, mouthful, E1B1B. And I'm mentioning these and using these ugly labels just because some of you watching may have taken a genetic test and may be in some of these groups. We'll talk about why that may be the case in a moment. To keep it easier to follow which branch we're talking about, I'm going to assign them separate colors. And I'm going to do that because we're going to look at the geography of each of these lineages in Africa. And the geography has some shocking implications for history that I wouldn't have predicted. So let's start with A. A is found in 2 major regions of Africa that may not seem like it has much significance up here, sort of North Central Africa and Southwest Africa. Well, the peoples who have A tend to be the click-speaking peoples of Southwest Africa. They're the Khoisan or the Bushmen. These are the rock stars of evolution because they have some of these longest branches, which they say then are the key to looking at African history. We've just seen the evidence for that not being the case. But there's still a fascinating people group, as well as the people up here, which are the Sudanese ones, including the Dinka. I say they're very interesting because of their features. Africa has some of the greatest diversity in physical features on the planet. You've got people in Sudan who have some of the darkest skin on the planet and some of the tallest people on the globe, and they have an Asian look to their eyes. Some of the click speakers, they actually have clicks that I can't even do myself as part of their language. They have very light skin, light brown. These are very, very dark brown. These are very light brown. They also have Asian looking eyes. And so this raises all sorts of questions as to what is their history. B has a fairly similar distribution. Down here, up here, and a little bit in between. There's pygmy peoples, very short stature peoples in Central Africa who also have some of this. There's also, I think, some click speakers in East Africa who share this lineage. That's A and B. The dominant group within Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is this E1B1A. You can see it's most of West Africa. And again, the size of these circles, I failed to mention this, I apologize. The size of these circles is a reflection of the relative concentration. What percentage of peoples in this region have this lineage? Well, big circles, lots of people, small circles, a little bit. So Sudan, lots of A and B, very little E1B1A. But in West Africa, Central Africa, and down into Southern Africa, lots of this E1B1A. You might recall from episode 4, we discussed the transatlantic slave trade, the sad history of 12 million sub-Saharan Africans forced against their will across the Atlantic, over 1 million failing to make it, 10.7 million arriving, heavily in South America, also in the Caribbean, and surprising to me, very few directly into North America, and just a tiny fraction into Europe. Well, given their origins, what might we expect their lineages to be? This slave trade drew heavily on Western Africa, and as well as the western coast of Central Africa, some of Southwest Africa. And so, unsurprisingly, perhaps, 62% of African Americans are in this E1B1A lineage, the echo of the slave trade. The last group I want to discuss is this E1B1B. Again, a mouthful, but it's basically the North and East African lineage that we'll return to momentarily. If you look at these all together, it might just look like a big jumbled mess with a little meaning. But there's some explosive clues in these patterns that'll unravel some of the mysteries of ancient Africa. Recall from previous episodes, we discussed languages. And rightly, creationists have pointed to the Genesis 11 dispersion at the Tower of Babel as the impetus for the formation of the major ethno-linguistic groups today. Genesis 10 lists about 70 men. And if you look at the number of languages today, you see there's a much bigger number of living languages compared to Genesis 10. And the answer to this comes from looking at the relationships among languages we speak today, for example. You can see looking at English and German words, there's a lot of similarities in words everyone needs to use. Father, mother, being born, life, so forth. There's more similarities between English and German than between English and Spanish. But Spanish and Latin have a lot more similarities to each other than either has to English. It's almost as if these similarities and differences imply historical relationships. This isn't evolution. This is language diversification following God's initial confusing of the tongues at Babel. And we saw that a general rule of thumb for identifying what these original language groupings were is this group we call family. Now, there's a little bit more than twice as many families as numbers of men in Genesis 10. We talked about in previous episodes how there's been an unusual multiplication of families, and multiplication I mean by in terms of the people classifying languages in the Americas. And even mainstream folks are talking about how that's likely going to be reduced to a very small number, and that'll bring the total number of families in much closer alignment with the Genesis 10 family number. So there's a very intriguing correlation here. So it looks like God separated these groups into their families, and within each family you have multiplication. Sort of like if you're familiar with our work on species, it's similar to the concept of God creating kinds, and then within a kind you get multiplication but not conversion from one kind to another. What about Africa? This is where we can bring our discussion to bear and see some profound correlations I didn't expect to find, and you may not have expected to find given everything we said about Europe. Notice how in Europe there's basically two language families. This light green, Indo-European, so the Germanic languages, the Romance languages, English, Spanish, French, German, Norwegian, all that. And this even extends into India. There's Sanskrit and other languages that are part of the same family. And there's one other family here, this dark green one, Uralic or Finno-Ugric, that's Hungarian, Finnish, and then some of the ones that stretch into modern Russia. Yet we saw at the genetic level, Europe is a hodgepodge of Central Asian origin lineages. There's different ones for Western versus Eastern Europe. There's a couple different ones for Eastern Europe. Looks like there's an indigenous European one. There's a whole mix. And it doesn't necessarily reflect the language groupings. Well, in Africa, there's about 5 language families. There's the Indo-European one down here, which I don't feel like we should even count because that's just due to the migration of Europeans to South Africa during the Age of Exploration. In terms of indigenous languages, if we can use that term, there's this one, Madagascar. It's part of the Austronesian. Episode 16, we talked about history of the Pacific and the connections between Indonesia and Madagascar. In terms of mainland Africa, there's this large Niger-Congo family in green. In lime green are the Khoisan, the Click-speaking peoples. Nilo-Saharan is this peach-colored one, which includes the very tall Dinka of Sudan, as well as the Maasai of Kenya. And then North Africa is dominated by these orange Afro-Asiatic languages like Arabic. Let's zoom in on Africa, change the colors slightly, and then compare it to the genetics we've just seen. Again, Madagascar is sort of the outlier here because it's connected to the east, to the Pacific. You've got the Indo-Europeans due to recent immigration from Europe, and then what I'm going to call the African languages. The Khoisan in blue, the two divisions of Niger-Congo in shades of brown, Nilo-Saharan, the Maasai and the Dinka in dark blue, and then the Afro-Asiatic in this tan color, light tan. Do you see any correlation to the genetics we discussed? If you look at this big mix, this busy diagram, it may not be obvious. So let's break it back down into its component parts. E1B1B, this North and East African lineage, is shockingly close to the distribution of the Afro-Asiatic language family. That's surprising. You don't see anything quite like this in Europe. Up here is the genetic groupings, and right up there is the language groupings, as if there might be some parallel history. E1B1A is this sub-Saharan lineage that covers much of West, Central, and Southern Africa, very close to the Niger-Congo distribution, which is West, Central, and goes down into Southern Africa. That's a remarkable correlation. A and B, even though they're classified as separate divisions, as we saw earlier, have a sort of overlapping distribution found in similar places, so that if you were to combine these into one circle, it'd be a fairly big circle of A and B down here, a decent sized AB circle up here, and down here and up here show overlap with the Nilo-Saharan and Khoisan language families. But there's a linkage here. They're found in both places. It's almost as if these two groups of people were once close to one another, perhaps intermixing, but now are divided by these Bantu languages. It's as if these two groups, even though they're separate languages, may have been in close geographical proximity until they were split, perhaps by an invasion of these Bantu peoples. Could this be the Bantu expansion to which mainstream scientists refer? I want to leave this sub-Saharan African history alone, though, for the moment, and turn our attention back to E1B1B, this North African and East African lineage, because it holds some even more clues that lead us closer to ancient Egypt. It's not just an African lineage. It spills over at low levels into the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, so Israel and such, Jordan, Turkey, and Southern Europe. Basically absent from Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, India, China. It's North African, but also here. And this represents then the fulfillment of the promise that so-called black white people exist. Light-skinned peoples who have African ancestry. Now I have to correct something. I've said they've had it for thousands of years. In developing and doing the research for this presentation, I'm going to add a little caveat that we'll get to momentarily. But notice there's a strong, dominant African lineage that has a presence in Spain, Italy, Balkan Peninsula. There are Europeans running around who probably look like me and Ken. And this is going to have spillover into the Americas, Australia as well, other places that were settled by Europeans. There are people who have ancestry in Africa and don't know it. Could be white supremacists who have ancestry in Africa and don't know it. Who are these people? To answer that question, I want to bring in the question of language again. Again, we saw this amazing overlap between genetics and language, which in Europe is unparalleled. Europe is this mix of invasion after invasion after invasion, yet fairly homogeneous linguistics. In Africa, the language seems to match the genetics. Just like the genetics, there's spillover of Afro-Asiatic into Arabia, Asia. Afro-Asiatic, Arabic, think of that language as being a dominant language as part of this language family. When I think of Arabic, I think of Muslims and Muhammad and the Islamic conquests. Now, initially, I thought this E1B1B lineage in blue here, I thought this was the echo of the Islamic slave trade. You might recall from episode 4 that there was this other slave trade, doesn't get as much attention as the transatlantic, yet it has a similar total number of people enslaved, 11 to 12 million. It lasts much longer than the transatlantic slave trade. So it's not this big rush of peoples within a few centuries. It's stretched out over 12 centuries. 600s, of course, is when Muhammad begins his conquests, and it extends all the way into the 1800s. And instead of moving people to the Americas, it moves people towards places where the Islamic peoples are. Now, I used to say this was the echo of the slave trade. I'm now leaning towards a different explanation for why this exists, why these lineages exist where they do, and what the history of this particular grouping of primarily African lineages represents. So let's dig deeper into the Islamic conquests, which begin in Arabia, and then begin expanding outward into close to Southern Asia, across North Africa, into Europe. This is not the permanent state of affairs, though, of course. We talked about last episode, in thinking of the history of the Jews, that by the mid-800s, the eastern part of this empire begins to be cut off and reconquered by Central Asians, Iranian, and Turkish peoples. And as well, they eventually get pushed out of Europe. The Spaniards reconquer, and the Muslims are pushed out of Europe right before Columbus set sail for the New World. This is what I'm going to focus, though, on for its relevance to E1B1B, this North African lineage. I said the Turks didn't stay there last time. They moved across and marched through the Middle East in the 1000s AD. And in short order, they were pushed out of the Middle East by a subsequent conquest from Central Asia, the Mongols, the greatest empire the world has ever seen. The Turks, though, persisted in the tip of modern-day Turkey, so that's how they went from Central Asia to modern-day Turkey. And that, again, this is something I have to keep reminding myself of. I think Turkish people, I think modern-day geographic Turkey, know their origins are in Central Asia. They reconquer, push out some of these Mongols, and their empire stretches into the Middle East. And we said last time this seems to be the most likely explanation for the distribution of this group J lineages. It's found at these levels, in these places, heavily in the Arabian Peninsula. The geography of the Ottoman Empire overlaps very well here. And the timing of various splits, there's multiple lines of evidence that I think point towards a Turkish origin for much of the modern peoples in these places. Let's zoom out a little bit so we can see Africa and compare it to this E1B1B. If we overlap these two distributions, there's sort of a complementary distribution. In other words, if you think about the history of the Islamic conquests, it's like the combination of J and E1B1B fits the distribution. You have to remember that after Muhammad comes the Turkish peoples, and it makes sense. There's an intriguing geographic correlation that I want to explore further. Who are these E1B1B peoples? So let's go back to the tree. Because of their name, E1B1B, and because we talked about E1B1A, you know they're close to that E1B1B lineage on the tree down here. So let's look at these two lineages next to each other. They're subdivisions of this E1B branch, and E1 is a deeper division. E is a deep division in the tree. E1B1B is up here, E1B1A is down here. So in a sense, forgetting about A and B for a moment, these two E lineages cover most of Africa, and they're sort of mutually exclusive by and large. They're basically North African and sub-Saharan African lineages. This is the dominant lineage in dark-skinned African peoples. Well, these two lineages have a common ancestor around 500 BC. Again, these are very rough numbers. It depends on where exactly you put Noah in the tree. We'll have much more to say about exactly where we put Noah in subsequent episodes. We'll get at that shortly. The first thing I want us to notice, though, is that this date for a major split in Africa is not that far from other splits we discussed in episode 16. Recall then that the very dark-skinned peoples of the Andaman Islands, they're basically southeast of India, close to the Southeastern Asian peninsula, Burma, Myanmar, Thailand, so forth. There's very dark-skinned peoples there that split off from, of all peoples, a Japanese lineage in 800 BC. And around that same time was a major split, again, among dark-skinned and light-skinned peoples. The people splitting off here around 800 BC include Siberians, India, peoples in India, Papua New Guinea, Australian Aborigines, another Japanese lineage. There's all sorts of activity happening around this ancient time period in the BC era. And we talked about how perhaps these peoples may have had an origin from a migration from Africa. We don't know yet, but there's this intriguing hypothesis that it suggests. And here we have a division within Africa, within a few centuries of that date. So was there some sort of major migratory activity in Africa in the first millennium before Christ? What's going on here? There's another implication of this connection, and I want to show it by trying to trace the history outwards. This is the explanation I'm leaning towards now. Instead of this being E1B1B, being dark-skinned sub-Saharan Africans who are being forced out of sub-Saharan Africa into the Islamic Empire to be slaves, I think there's something else. For one, you might recall from episode 4 that this Islamic slave trade has a different gender makeup than the transatlantic slave trade. Transatlantic slave trade, the people are trying to force people onto plantations to work the fields. It's about 2-to-1 men to women. This slave trade, the Islamic slave trade, is looking for household workers by and large. So it's 2-to-1 females to men. And we're looking at the Y chromosome lineage. So that's one reason why I'm not convinced this is necessarily a slave trade. It may be something else. So 500 BC, these two lineages are one people, one population. They have a common ancestor. And then in 500 BC, or so, around there, a split happens. And I'm going to say they go these directions. For one, because E1B1A becomes the dominant lineage in sub-Saharan Africa. Just statistically, you find some dark-skinned person in sub-Saharan Africa, or if you're in the Americas, you have dark skin, you have a high probability of being in this lineage. But these guys end up dominating North and East Africa, Ethiopia, Somalia, Libya, Algeria, Egypt. I'm suggesting they may have also gone to the Arabian Peninsula. So that over 1,000 years later, 600 to 800s, when Muhammad and his band of Arab Muslims begin expansion, it may be this E1B1B lineage that does the expanding. I find this intriguing, eerie correlation between the geographic extent of the Muhammad Empire and his descendants and the distribution of E1B1B. Another reason why is when I was initially getting into linguistics, when I saw the distribution of Afro-Asiatic languages, North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, I thought, that's the Muslim conquest. That has to be it. How else can you explain the distribution of these languages? And here you see a genetic lineage that is very strongly correlated with it. The only exception is it isn't dominant now in the Middle East, but I think there's a reason for that. Fast forward a few centuries to the thousands, we talked about the arrival of the Turks from Central Asia. They go marching through the Middle East. I think this is how you begin to lose the dominance of E1B1B in the Middle East. Turks, of course, then get nearly extinguished by the Mongols. They survive, and so by the 1600s, they begin pushing north and south, north into Europe, south into the Arabian Peninsula. I think start kicking out some of the original Arab Muslims. Turkish Muslims take over. Let's zoom out a little bit further so we can see the rest of the world and how this history plays out. At some point, while this history is going on, E1B1A begins its expansion in sub-Saharan Africa. So much so that by the time the transatlantic slave trade begins, these are the peoples they're enslaving and bringing to the New World. And that sequence of events, I think, explains the distribution of these lineages that we see today. It raises new questions. I think it explains, basically what I'm saying is I think this is originally an African lineage that gets into Arabia, expands this direction and that direction, and then gets replaced by Turkish peoples who don't quite get as dominant in these directions. New questions. Yes, these people share a common ancestor. Who were they? And what did they look like? So let me back up for a sec. I'm saying these might actually be Arab Muslims who have African origins, originally, 500 BC. So at some point, there's dark-skinned peoples, but you look at Arabs today, they don't look like sub-Saharan Africans. At some point, I think there was a dark-skinned ancestor because, again, one of these lineages becomes all these dark-skinned peoples. This is where we bring in ancient Egypt. These people have a common ancestor. Then they split in 500 BC. This, I'm saying, looks like it probably became the Arab Muslims who then went conquering and remained the dominant lineage in North Africa, but got replaced by Turkish people in the Middle East. These people went on to dominate sub-Saharan Africa. Well, the geographic connection between this group and this group flows right through here. So what was going on in ancient Egypt in the 500s BC? Could Egypt be the origin of these two peoples? And since E1B1B eventually spills into Europe, could there be Europeans who have ancient Egyptian lineages? Within a century or two of this date, 500s BC, the rulers of Egypt are Nubians, dark-skinned peoples from Sudan and Ethiopia. They are at some point, one of the ruling dynasties in Egypt. Is this the ancient Nubians? Could this be the kingdom of Axum of Ethiopia or of Meroe? To answer these questions, hope you'll join us next time in future episodes of the New History of the Human Race.
Well, Nathaniel, it's very interesting. I was thinking as you're going through all that, most people have been taught this out of Africa idea because of the evolutionary paradigm, that man evolved out of Africa, came from the ape-like ancestors, started walking upright and so on, and then moved out around the earth. So there's a lot at stake here from a perspective of the secularists, because if the history you are giving here is correct, and it doesn't make sense, and it fits with your genetic studies, which confirms what the Bible's been saying all along. I mean, it's not just how do these different cultures come about. I mean, the whole evolutionary worldview is really challenged here and undermined. So there's a lot at stake for the secularists, isn't there?
There's much at stake, and what makes it so significant from my perspective for the mainstream community is what I just described is not a long-winded, here's why the evolutionists are all wrong. It's here's why the biblical timescale is right and how you can make sense of all this. And this connects and this connects. And it's a positive, this makes sense, which is a much harder argument to counter, because their last resort historically for dealing with creationists is, well, give us something better. We just did. Now what are you going to do? They haven't gotten to that point in the debate to have a response to that. So this has gigantic ramifications for their model.
And the other thing too that I was thinking, looking at some comments that people have made to some of the sessions that you've done, I think people have this idea there's no way that sort of change could occur that quickly. But the point is it can. It's just they've been indoctrinated because of the evolutionary paradigm, once again, to think that such changes takes place over thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. But when you've got all that genetic potential right there that God put in the original humankind, I mean, such change can occur very quickly. Within one generation, you can have significant changes, as you've shown. Within 2 or 3, I mean, you could have dark skin and then suddenly you've got light skinned, and people think, how could that happen so quickly? But it's very easy when you understand genetics. And I think it's just the indoctrination in the millions of years, indoctrination in out of Africa idea, man evolved from ape-like creatures, indoctrination that, those changes take long periods of time, cause some to say, how could what you be saying is right? And yet what you're saying fits with real science, observational science. And when you start to understand genetics, you realize those changes can happen so quickly.
And I even had to correct my own view on this, I was going to go looking for some images to illustrate what I was saying, and I was going to make the point when I was developing this presentation that, see, just look how different the dark-skinned sub-Saharan Africans are from the Arab North Africans in the Middle East. And then you go looking for images of Muslims and Arabs, and you're like, there's a lot of pretty dark-skinned Arabs that still run around North Africa and the Middle East. I can't make this point. This may, in fact, be the echo of the African origin of these peoples. They've intermixed then with other Asians, and so there's middle brown. But you look at some of the peoples today in Egypt, in Libya, in Algeria, in Saudi Arabia, and I had to say, I can't do this. There's a lot of dark-skinned peoples here. This contrast is not what I initially assumed it was. There's, to me, still a lot of physical echo of this history in the peoples of these places today.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other ramifications too, as you've been saying. I mean, you mentioned white supremacists who could have really dark-skinned people in their ancestry not that long ago. See, they would not like to think of that as possible from an evolutionary perspective. Oh, they've got this, superiority idea, and this has taken a long time and so on. But to understand we're so closely related didn't take as long as you think. We're looking at cultures today that have developed as a result of all this. We're more closely related than people think. So episode 20, tomorrow, the neglected biblical clues to ancient history. And I know in your notes that you sent me, you said new biblical discoveries is a dangerous phrase. So I'm wondering what you mean by that. And I guess we're going to find out in episode 20. Want to give us just a really brief summary, and then we'll finish this session?
We've rightly talked about the 7 C's of history, which hit at the major points of debate among evolutionists and creationists: creation, corruption, confusion, or creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, Christ, conquest, or Christ, cross, consummation. And there you have, here's what the Bible says versus evolution plus the gospel. I've been forced to go back and say, okay, if we're going to dig at the details of the history of civilization after the flood, I went into this naively and realized there, and have discovered along the way, there's some other key biblical signposts you have to take into account when doing this history. So I'll tell some of my own story and some other clues, I think, from scripture that I've missed and perhaps others have missed. And I say it's always dangerous because how many of our opponents have said, well, and how many opponents will continue to say, well, there's this missing clue in Genesis 1 that gives us a clue it's millions of years old. Wrong. That's not what it says. So I go into questions like this with fear and trepidation of you can't be rewriting the text. But at the same time, we're all fallible humans. The Bible is God's word. It's a massive book that takes a lifetime to master. And even then, we haven't explored all of its depths. And will we ever explore the depths of God's nature and his acts? So I'm only 40 years old, and there's things I've learned along the way. And the key question, of course, is does this come from reading things into the text or saying, actually, I read this passage and noticed this for the first time. It's been there all along, but I just haven't paid attention to it. Those are some of the things we're going to discuss next episode, though I encourage our audience to be Bereans and always hear claims like this by comparing scripture with scripture, which is what we should be doing. And I think we'll find some fascinating clues and then confirmations in genetics of human anthropology.
And you already warned people, even in this episode, that sometimes we have these ideas that we cling to, and they're cherished ideas, and we might think they're like even a silver bullet or something, but are they biblical? Does it really fit with what we observe? And sometimes you've got to give up some of these ideas. Models built on, even on scripture, models built on scripture are always subject to change. You've got to remember that. Scripture is not. But sometimes we like to hold on to our models because they're our pet models. So people, get ready. You've already had your models challenged all the way through, and it's going to happen again with episode 20. So thanks, Dr. Jeanson.
Thank you.